House do now adjourn. Matt Warman.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. You have a lot of misfortune in your family. These are the words, Mr. Speaker, a registrar spoke to me when I registered the death of my mother, who died 10 years ago today, aged 53. Kind, compassionate, understated. He said them because just 6 weeks previously I had registered the death of my father. I was, Mr. Speaker, 27. I was not a child, but I was, I think, too young to know how to bear some of the sadness I felt in 2009. And some by 27 have borne far more emotion. They've got married, they've had families, they've served their country, they've sometimes died for their countries, and often also buried both their parents. But 27 is young to be an orphan in the Western world. I struggled to admit it then, and I struggle to admit it now, but I found it impossibly hard. And I should have looked for help, because grief makes us all angry, irrational, upset and difficult. And perhaps too many of us in this House, Mr. Speaker, think strength is incompatible with weakness. Perhaps too many of us are stubborn. It is often said that that which does not kill us makes us stronger. And perhaps that which kills those closest to us can make us stronger still, but few can do it on their own. I want in this adjournment debate to say simply to those that struggle with the loss of loved ones, and even close family who are not so closely loved, that there is already help out there, that you are strongest when you take it up and go to the doctors or just talk to friends. But yes, more too can be done by government and by others. This week we celebrate Mother's Day. Up and down the country, mothers will be appreciated through cards, breakfast in bed and often questionable artwork from their children. For some, though, myself included, it's a reminder of what you have lost. To use the modern jargon, it's a trigger. And I want to thank you, Mr. Speaker, for letting my personal circumstances have some influence on the parliamentary calendar. Changing it seems to be all the rage at the moment, but you know, Mr. Speaker, that MPs are surely at their best when we draw on our personal experiences. And I also want to say, too, that it is the coming of Mother's Day that gives this debate a broader relevance, as I also want to raise the question of what more we in government can do to support those who have been bereaved, and how we can encourage wider society to make small, seemingly insignificant changes that can prevent immense upset to so many people. Bereavement charity Cruise currently has on its homepage the claim that they can help this Mother's Day, and that is hugely welcome, but such is the volume the charity has suspended its email help service and its phone lines aren't open 24/7. It takes more than charity, Mr. Speaker, to tackle bereavement. It takes society in all its little family platoons. The government has done great work in introducing bereavement counselling for parents who lose children, thanks in part to my honourable friends, the members for Colchester and for Eddisbury, and others as well across this House. I'm not calling for a similar kind of bereavement leave for everyone, because businesses in truth are largely respectful and they are also hugely varied. However, I do know from personal experience that many people do not feel the true impact of their loss for weeks, months, even years on some occasions, after the person they've loved passes away. And often they are in shock or trying to be strong for others, on top of all the mundane considerations that have to be dealt with in these circumstances. I give way to my honourable friend.
I'm grateful for my honourable friend giving way, and he's making an incredibly powerful speech, which I know his parents would have been absolutely proud to have if they could have witnessed it. And I know the sense of delay. When my father died 30 years ago this year from mesothelioma, I remember reading in diaries later on my mother crying out for help, writing in a diary 9 months later. And so it's incumbent on us to recognise that delay, and I appreciate everything he's saying.
Thank you. I thank him for that intervention, and that is why, in some ways, I'm calling for the government to have ongoing support for those who are recently bereaved, but also an open-ended offer of counselling on the NHS, which can be accessed when they are ready and not at the easiest point for the NHS.
Thank you for giving way, Mr. Speaker. I can also commend the Honourable Gentleman for Boston Skegness for bringing this forward and for his own personal story that he's telling here today. Across the UK of Great Britain and Northern Ireland, the Honourable Gentleman will know 1 in 4 people suffer from mental health issues. Many of those come off the grief of someone very close to him leaving at a very sudden time. Early intervention, I think, is the key issue. When it comes to government responding to the Minister responding, does he agree early intervention with the use of crews and perhaps maybe other groups who reach out there as well? I think right away of church groups, of the ministers who are there on call if you need them.
I thank him for that intervention, and I agree with him, and it's something that I'll mention in a minute or so. I do think there should be a dedicated mental health helpline through the NHS, which under the long-term plan will be accessed via 111, and I think it's important that that understands that bereavement for a long time is an exacerbating factor for loneliness, for suicide, and for a lot more. It's a red flag that should be recorded for a long time. And the importance of that ongoing support cannot be overstated. We have spoken in this House many times about the tragedy of the growing rise of male suicide. While things are improving, there is still a huge stigma around men feeling unable to open up and showing their emotions, although I'm hopefully doing all right today. This is why I think it is particularly important that we normalise that support around bereavement, and we don't leave it solely to those affected to reach out to organisations such as Crews or the Samaritans. That registrar who I spoke to 10 years ago should have been trained to offer a signpost, although I confess that if he was, or if he did, I was in no state to listen. And the NHS and our volunteering strategy should include better plans to encourage more people to train as volunteer bereavement friends and counsellors, like the hugely valuable work that we see in Dementia Friends, or as Sue Ryder has called it, the bereavement first aiders. And
I'm immensely grateful to him for giving way. He's making a fantastic speech and a series of very, very good points. I'm not ashamed to say at all that I had bereavement counselling when my son died, and I can't see why you wouldn't. You go to the doctor when you're feeling unwell. Of course you go to the bereavement counsellor when you need help with grief. Would my honourable friend agree with me that it's very important that we normalise this?
I absolutely agree. That there is a role for us to play in opening up the debate and shining light on steps outside organisations can take to make bereavement in general more bearable, but also on the theme of this debate, to make Mother's Day or Father's Day less difficult for those who have experienced such loss.
In earlier, I just wonder as well if there may be a role for funeral directors in this, and that the links they obviously have with the families as well. I'd like to congratulate the honourable gentleman on what is a very moving speech.
I thank her for those kind words, and the Co-op have done interesting and really valuable work on this, and I think part of what the department can do is putting some of that stuff together. And one interesting example that I would like to see introduced across the board is a new policy from an online flower company called Bloom and Wild. And they have given customers the opportunity to opt out of Mother's Day emails, as they recognise that it can be a very sensitive time for some. And if other companies were to follow suit, then the dread, and I do mean dread, around this day might be mitigated for many people. I personally don't feel, for whatever reason, the same dread about Father's Day marketing, but obviously it should be equal, just in case anyone's worried. And it could be a part of something that an organisation like the Advertising Standards Authority could make part of a voluntary code around data. And Mr. Speaker, I'm not a Tory asking for some enormous nanny state, but I'm saying another tick box when you sign up for yet more emails would be kind. And companies bang on about corporate social responsibility all the time, so why not try this? This debate, Mr. Speaker, to close, is important to me for 3 reasons. Yes, it's a sad anniversary, but I'm lucky to have this platform to say the government is right to acknowledge that it needs to do more to ensure there is ongoing support for those who have lost someone that they love. And it's a chance to open up the discussion of how everyone in society and business can play a role in increasing the sensitivity with which these difficult days that last for many years are handled. And I hope that by securing this debate with your good offices, Mr. Speaker, that we will move fractionally closer to ensuring that all men and women who, like myself, may not always have felt comfortable discussing such emotional topics are able to do so more freely, to seize the help that is there, and maybe ultimately to need that help just a fraction less.
Thank you. Minister Jackie Doyle-Price to reply to the debate.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you also for allowing this debate. I'm really glad to have the opportunity to respond to my honourable friend, who has spoken incredibly movingly about his personal experience. And, you know, in this place, it's very difficult to speak rawly from the heart. But I have to say to him, he's done good today. He's done extremely well. And, you know, again, brought into stark relief, we are all human beings in this place, although you'd be forgiven for thinking otherwise in recent days. But we all do bring our own experiences. And, you know, it takes a lot of courage to actually share some of those. I'm not always quite so confident and brave as he to share my own stories, but it's a pleasure to reply to him today. The effects of bereavement and loss are different for all of us, and as he's showed it makes it different in terms of age. It depends on our family circumstances, who we can reach out to for help. But I think one of the things I'd really like to land is that grief is lifelong. Grief never leaves you. When you lose a loved one, that stays with you for the rest of your life. And he mentioned triggers. Those triggers can come at any point. And so it's very important that we, and I as Minister in the Department of Health, do ensure that we do have sufficient support for people who are grieving, because it can come from nowhere. And he mentioned using the word normalise, I think, is actually so important when we're talking about any aspect of mental ill health and mental stress, because it is not uncommon for all of us to go through periods of feeling like that. And it becomes very difficult, particularly for men, to reach out and ask for help, because it is seen as a sign of weakness. And it really shouldn't be, because none of us are... No man is an island, I think, is a very trite phrase that we often use, but it is true. And it's also some people who, you know, perhaps they're the linchpin of their family and they feel that they can't grieve because they can't show weakness because they need to be strong for everyone else. So it will be a mark of a compassionate society that we make sure that we have services for them. And, you know, from a health perspective, it's really important that we do, because people who are suffering from that are more likely from physical ill health too, from weight loss, depression and anxiety, and I've witnessed that within my own family following a bereavement. So we must make sure that we have and encourage people to access support from bereavement counsellors. He talked very movingly about the triggers and the particular trigger of Mother's Day for him. And it really brought home to me some of the... He lost his mother and his father at a young age, and I think the sense of grief when life ends prematurely is perhaps more acute than ever. So I'm reminded of people I've met who are victims of terror, for example, or the Grenfell Tower, where, again, that's life ended very prematurely. And sometimes we don't even think, actually, when we're seeing pictures of these events flashed up. Every time, you know, Grenfell Tower comes up, we see pictures of that fire. We really risk re-traumatising people. And I think there is, as a society, we really need to start looking at some of those behaviours. Often, you know, these things happen with the best of intentions. I remember when we started the inquiry, the independent inquiry into Grenfell, and obviously, there was great interest in the news, but for those pictures to be flashed out on every news programme really could not have been very pleasant for those left behind. So I think there is a role for us, and we need to think very carefully in terms of our news reporting, you know, our broadcasters, what's available on the internet, And again, there's a challenge for editorial teams there about just how they report these things after the event, because we really shouldn't be expecting people to just tolerate living with that ongoing trauma. So bereavement counselling is available to people at any time. I think it's very important to realise that the grieving process does last all your life. Those triggers could be suppressed for decades and decades and then suddenly be triggered again. So that is something we should be making available to anyone at any time when they need it. The first step would be for someone to access a counsellor should be through their local GP or by self-referring to CRUISE, which as my honourable friend has mentioned. And I'm really pleased actually that we will be making more services available through the 111 service, because again, the fact that people can access that care when they need it, that advice, that support, will actually mitigate any harm that they're experiencing. CRUISE bereavement care is funded by CCGs and local authorities and has branches all over the country, and they offer free confidential advice to anyone who needs it. It is their aim that everyone who loses someone has someone to talk to when they need to, and I'm really pleased with the service that they offer. It could be improved, however, the quality of service, so we must make sure that we work with NHS England to develop better provision so that everyone has access to it. I cannot commend enough the input of the voluntary and charity sector. One of the things I keep saying to CCGs is we shouldn't just look at mental ill health as something that should be medicalised. Quite often, support that can just be given by voluntary sector providers and other people with other skills can be just as important in helping people get better and get used to their condition as any appointment with a clinician. As I mentioned, and my honourable friend mentioned, the NHS 111 service will provide 24/7 mental health crisis support, and that will be access to a trained mental health professional who can signpost to a treatment and other support. So it's really holistic. We need to have the voluntary services in place, we need bereavement counselling in place, and we need mental health professionals where those are needed. Now, my honourable friend shared with us this evening that Mother's Day was a particularly difficult time for him, and we know that any kind of anniversary can cause and reignite that grief. But I was very interested to hear of the policy that he's alluded to from Bloom and Wild, and I think that's a really good reminder of how just a bit of sensitive thinking by all of us can just really make life so much easier for everyone. So, I would encourage all companies who are involved in things at sensitive times and actually who build relationships with their customers, frankly, to really be a lot more sensitive in how they contact them. It's just good behaviour and it's good corporate social responsibility, as he said. So again, obviously advertising in the United Kingdom is regulated by the Advertising Standards Authority, but I think they can do a lot more to spread good practice and actually encourage companies to think more carefully about it, because really every one of us can support people who've been bereaved. I'm very pleased to see my honourable friend from Edinburgh here, and the honourable lady from Banbury was here earlier too. She's no longer in her place. I think when it's now an annual fixture that we debate baby last week, and there is not a dry eye in the House when honourable friends share their direct experience. And what I find amazing about that is that it wasn't until recently so taboo to talk about such things. And I guess that's where we are today. We in this House have in this sphere have led the way in acknowledging our grief and talking about it. And in so doing, we are giving a good example to the rest of society. And I have to say, I know it's very difficult for colleagues to, as I say, talk so rawly about the emotions that they've experienced. But those pictures, Mr. Speaker, when they go out from this House, which is showing us not as a bear pit scoring points, but showing real, naked human emotion, are the things that actually I think the public want to see, because they're the things that remind them that we all in this place are citizens of the United Kingdom with all the problems and challenges that everyone else has. We're not some class apart, living a completely different life, not in the real world, as some would say. And those pictures of the baby loss debate that happen every year really do open the eyes of people and tackle that taboo, so that I would very, very much hope that people watching those would think, actually, do you know what? It's okay to feel bad. It's okay to have a good cry about something that happened to me many years ago. Because grief is something that you have to manage. You know, you will never stop missing that loved one. You will never regret the fact that you've lost them. Much of the time, memories are happy, and you can celebrate in your own mind their life and their contribution to your life. But the regret that they can't see what you're doing now is something that can never leave you. And that's just a sign of being a good human being. So I really sincerely thank my honourable friend for bringing this debate forward tonight. Just one final thing, I think, before I end. He raised the whole issue of suicide, and particularly male suicide, which again I think underlines the need for us particularly to encourage men to acknowledge that, you know what, it's okay to have a good cry, it's okay to ask for help. You know, it's not, you don't have to be superhuman, it's not a sense of weakness. And we need to do much more to encourage men to open up. And I've seen that also very directly in my role as the Minister for Suicide Prevention, having met families who've lost young men through suicide. I have to say, Mr. Speaker, it might sound weird, but it's a privilege to have heard their stories, and for them to be able to share their pain. I find it so inspiring that people who've gone through the most tragic things actually want to use that experience to make life better for everyone else. And perhaps that's a good note on which to finish, because, you know, I think we're all very proud of my honourable friend today, because he's done exactly that. He's shared his pain so that we will all learn from it. And, you know, that's the best of British, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you. Thank you. The question is that this House do now adjourn. As many as are of that opinion say aye. Aye. If the contrary, no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it. Order. Order.